The sky that afternoon mirrored the grief of everyone present. Heavy clouds hung low over the cemetery like a morning veil, and the cold wind cut through the silence like a blade. The sound of boots pressing into the damp ground was barely audible against the weight of the moment. Lined up in solemn formation, the officers kept their eyes fixed on the center of the ceremony, where the photo of Sergeant Rob Maddox stood, smiling, calm, unknowing. In front of the wooden easel sat Scout, a German shepherd with a heavy stare and a tense body. He didn't wear a badge, but everyone knew he was one of them. For 5 years, Scout had served beside Rob, tracking suspects, rescuing victims, and facing danger head-on. But more than duty, there was a bond between them, silent, fierce, unbreakable. And now, the loyal partner stood alone, guarding the memory of the man who never left his side. The police chief's voice trembled as he began his tribute. "Rob was more than an officer," he said, but the words seemed to drift past most ears. All eyes were locked on Scout, still as stone, his gaze pinned to the portrait of his fallen partner. There was something in the dog's eyes, something deeper than training, a grief too real, too raw. It was as if Scout truly understood what death had taken from him. Then, without a sound, Scout stood. Slowly, like every muscle carried the weight of goodbye. He stepped forward toward the portrait, his movements slow, deliberate. No one dared to interrupt. When he reached the frame, Scout lay down and let out a low, haunting howl. It wasn't a bark. It wasn't instinct. It was sorrow. Real, profound sorrow. Officers began to weep. Even Barbara Lawson, Rob's mother, brought her hand to her mouth. She had heard that same mournful sound the night her son was killed. But what happened next changed everything. Scout raised his head, turned slowly, and locked eyes with a man standing on the far right of the honor guard. A new lieutenant, quiet man. Scout let out a low growl, soft, but sharp as glass. His fur bristled. The man stepped back. His face went pale. The others noticed but didn't speak. Scout didn't break his stare. Something was wrong, and the dog knew it. And in that moment, beneath a heavy sky, among tears and silence, something shifted. What was meant to be a farewell was turning into the first clue of a truth buried deep. Scout wasn't done serving justice. If the scene moved you, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Scout's story is just beginning. Grief has turned into suspicion, and the truth is surfacing. What did he see in that man? Something's wrong, and Scout won't stop until justice is done. The ceremony had ended, but something about it lingered like smoke after a fire. Most of the attendees had already left, umbrellas raised against the light drizzle that began to fall. The honor guard disbanded slowly, their boots echoing across the cemetery paths. But Scout didn't move. He remained by the portrait of Rob, his head lowered, ears alert, watching. Barbara Lawson stood near the gravesite, her eyes swollen and distant. She'd barely spoken since the final salute. Now, watching Scout stare into nothing, her hands trembled slightly. She turned to the police chief beside her. "He growled," she whispered, "at that man." The chief didn't respond right away. He knew exactly who she meant. Lieutenant Dean Mercer, recently transferred from a nearby precinct. Quiet, competent, no disciplinary record. And yet, Scout's reaction had been unmistakable. Back at the station later that evening, the atmosphere was subdued. Scout was taken to his kennel, but he refused to eat. He paced restlessly, tail stiff, ears twitching at the smallest sound. Officer Jenna Brooks, one of the department's K-9 handlers, watched him through the bars. "He's not right," she said to herself. "Something's off." She remembered Scout from past assignments. Loyal, obedient, sharp. He never growled without cause. Never stared at someone like that unless he sensed something deeply wrong. Chief Delgado sat alone in his office, the light of his desk lamp casting long shadows against the walls. He opened Rob's personnel file, flipping through it slowly, as if the pages themselves could offer closure. Rob had been working a quiet drug case in the last weeks of his life. Low-level street dealers, nothing unusual. But Delgado's eyes stopped on a line in Rob's final report. New lead from inside the department. Source unreliable but familiar. His brow furrowed. Scout's behavior wasn't just mourning. It was a message. Delgado felt it in his gut. The way the dog had locked eyes with Mercer. The way Mercer had flinched. That wasn't coincidence. He picked up the phone and dialed Officer Brooks. I need you to bring Scout in tomorrow morning. I want you to walk him through Rob's locker, his cruiser, everything, and get me Mercer's transfer papers. Meanwhile, Mercer sat alone in his apartment, staring at an unopened bottle of bourbon on the counter. The silence around him was deafening. He reached for the bottle, stopped midway, then let his hand fall. He looked out the window, breathing heavily. Scout's eyes haunted him. It was as if the dog had seen through him, seen everything. The next morning arrived with a cold, biting wind that swept across the parking lot of the precinct. Scout's paws clicked sharply against the linoleum floors as Officer Jenna Brooks led him down the hallway. The old building smelled of paper, sweat, and steel, familiar, grounding sense for most officers. But for Scout, today something smelled different. Something wrong. Jenna brought Scout to Rob Maddox's locker first. She opened the narrow metal door slowly, revealing the last remnants of a man who never got to finish his shift. His uniform still hung neatly on the hook. A half-used bottle of aftershave. A photo of Barbara holding Rob as a baby, curled at the edge from age. Scout stepped forward without hesitation. He sniffed inside the locker deeply, then sat, quiet, still, focused. Then came Rob's cruiser, parked in the rear of the lot, untouched since the day he died. As Jenna opened the door, Scout leapt in, nose working furiously. He moved from the driver's seat to the floorboard, to the passenger side. Suddenly, he froze. His body stiffened. He began to growl, a low, guttural sound that came from somewhere deep in his chest. Jenna narrowed her eyes. "What is it, boy?" she asked softly, stepping closer. Scout's snout was pressed against the floor mat beneath the passenger seat. Jenna knelt down and reached in carefully. Taped underneath was a small flash drive, wrapped tightly in black electrical tape. Her breath caught in her throat. She looked around, heart racing. "Rob, what the hell were you onto?" she whispered. The dog sat beside her, ears perked, waiting. The memory stick was warm from the heater vents, but it felt heavier than it should. Chief Delgado stared at the drive on his desk as if it were a live explosive. He plugged it into his laptop, hands trembling slightly. The folder opened with no password. Inside, a series of audio recordings. The first file began to play. Rob's voice, recorded late at night in what sounded like the cab of his cruiser. "I don't have proof yet, but I'm telling you, someone on the inside is feeding them information. Someone we trust. And I think it's Mercer." Across town, Lieutenant Dean Mercer was in the station's locker room, tying his boots. A knock on the metal door made him flinch. It was nothing, just nerves. But the weight in his chest told him he was running out of time. Scout had seen him, had smelled it on him. The fear, the guilt, the blood in his hands he thought no one could trace, except a dog who wouldn't forget. The mood inside Chief Delgado's office had changed. The room felt colder now, even with the sun climbing through the blinds. The audio recordings on the flash drive weren't just suspicions, they were detailed. Rob Maddox had been onto something dangerous. His voice, calm but tense, described late-night phone calls, missing evidence from locked rooms, and a name whispered more than once. Lieutenant Dean Mercer. Jenna sat across from the chief, Scout curled at her feet like a soldier awaiting orders. Delgado leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. "We have enough to open an internal investigation." Quietly, he muttered. "But if Mercer's involved with whoever Rob was tracking, we have to assume he's not acting alone." He looked down at Scout. "That dog knew. He tried to tell us the day Rob died. We just didn't listen." Scout's ears perked up slightly, as if responding to the shift in tone. Jenna reached down and gently scratched his neck. "He's not done helping," she said softly. "He wants this as much as we do. But deep down, Jenna felt something tightening around her chest, a fear she hadn't voiced yet. If Rob was murdered, and if someone inside the department helped cover it up, who else knew? And who was watching them now? Meanwhile, Mercer stood outside a diner on the edge of town, staring through the window at someone seated alone in a booth. He adjusted his jacket, face grim. Across from that window sat an older man with a weathered face and a badge clipped to his belt, a retired officer who once served under Rob. Mercer stepped inside and slid into the booth across from him. The conversation was brief, tense. "You said you burned everything," Mercer growled under his breath. The man didn't look up. "I said I burned what I had. Didn't say Rob didn't have backup." That sentence alone made Mercer's blood run cold. Back at the precinct, Delgado reviewed surveillance footage from the week before Rob died. One clip caught his attention. Mercer entering the evidence room alone, after hours, then emerging 18 minutes later empty-handed. There was no record of him signing in. No official reason for being there. Delgado paused the video. Scout watched the screen, ears standing. Then, as if on cue, the dog let out a soft, throaty growl. Everything was unraveling faster than expected. Mercer knew they were close. But what Delgado didn't know, what Jenna hadn't told him yet, was that the final audio file on the drive had a timestamp, recorded just hours before Rob died. And in it, Rob said a single sentence that chilled her to the bone. "If anything happens to me, Scout will know who did it." The precinct was quieter than usual, as if the building itself could feel the tension tightening in the air. Chief Delgado stared at the paused frame on his computer screen. Mercer slipping into the evidence room without clearance. The timestamp matched perfectly with the timeline Rob had laid out in his recordings. Every thread Rob had pulled before his death now pointed to one place, and one man. In the hallway outside the chief's office, Jenna clutched a pair of headphones, her face pale. She had just finished listening to the final audio file on Rob's flash drive, the one he recorded only hours before his death. His voice was low, urgent, almost whispering. "If anything happens to me, Scout will know who did it. He always does. He's seen the man before." The next sound in the recording wasn't Rob's voice. It was Scout growling. Then, just barely audible, footsteps. And a second voice, a man's voice. "You should have stayed out of it." Jenna burst into Delgado's office. "You need to hear this," she said, handing over the headphones. As he listened, the color drained from his face. The voice in the recording wasn't just familiar, it was someone he trusted. Someone who'd eaten dinner at his house. Someone who still wore the uniform. Mercer's voice was cold, almost empty. Rob figured it out, and now we know why he didn't make it home. Meanwhile, Mercer sat in his car, parked in the shadows behind a gas station just outside town. His fingers drummed against the steering wheel. He knew. He could feel them closing in. It wasn't just the chief anymore. Jenna was smart. And that dog Scout, he wasn't like others. He remembered things. Smells. Faces. Emotions. Mercer lit a cigarette with trembling hands. His phone buzzed. Unknown number. He didn't answer. At the same time, Jenna and Delgado reviewed the internal case files Rob had left behind. There were connections neither of them had noticed at first. Evidence signed out and never returned. Anonymous tips traced back to dead burner phones. And payments, large payments, deposited into a shell account. The shell account led to a private security firm. One that had employed Mercer briefly before his return to the force. Scout, resting at Jenna's side, suddenly stood. His ears twitched. His body tensed. Delgado raised an eyebrow. "He hears something." Jenna grabbed her coat and keys. "We're not waiting anymore," she said. "We're going to Rob's house. There might be something else he left behind. Something Mercer didn't find." As they opened the precinct doors, a shadow moved across the roof of a parked car nearby, watching, waiting, because Mercer wasn't done yet. And Scout's memory was the one thing he couldn't erase. Scout heard something, and he never forgets. Do you think Rob left one last clue behind? Or did Mercer miss something? Comment what you think Jenna and Delgado will find at Rob's house. The truth is close, but someone is still watching. Rob Maddox's house sat quiet at the edge of town, surrounded by tall pine trees and the kind of silence that made every creak of the wooden porch feel louder than it should. The blinds were still drawn, just as he had left them. Jenna unlocked the door slowly, the air inside thick with dust and something else, memory. Scout stepped in first, nose low, tail straight, scanning the room like it was still a crime scene. Every corner of the house felt untouched. Coffee mugs still on the sink, a jacket draped over the back of a chair. But Scout wasn't interested in any of that. He walked straight down the hallway, then stopped in front of a closed door. Rob's study. Jenna followed quietly and turned the knob. Inside, the room was neat, too neat. A single lamp on the desk, and a bookshelf filled with binders and legal pads. Scout walked to the bookshelf, sniffed along the base, and sat. Jenna crouched and ran her fingers behind the shelf. Something was taped underneath one of the bottom shelves. A thin leather notebook, wrapped tightly with an elastic band. She opened it. Inside were pages of Rob's handwriting, notes about an informant, sketches of Mercer's schedule, names, dates. There was even a line circled twice in red ink. He was there the night of the bust. Mercer shouldn't have been on scene. Back at the precinct, Delgado was running background on the security firm Mercer had worked for, Argonne Private Defense, when something disturbing appeared. Argonne had once been under federal investigation for training mercenaries in illegal tactics and planting insiders inside local law enforcement. The report had been buried quietly. Mercer's file, upon closer look, had several redacted sections. Parts of his past weren't just hidden, they'd been erased. Jenna's phone buzzed. A message from Delgado. "We have a bigger problem." Mercer wasn't just covering up a murder. He was part of something organized. She looked over at Scout, who was still sitting by the shelf, unmoving, like he was guarding something. Then she noticed the window behind the desk, slightly open. That window had been locked the last time Rob's house was searched. She stood slowly and drew her gun. Outside, unseen behind the trees, Mercer stood with a pistol drawn, watching through binoculars. He could see Scout, could see Jenna moving carefully across the room. He hadn't expected them to come here tonight. He hadn't expected the dog to remember the study, or the notebook. And as he moved quietly through the darkness toward the back door, he told himself one thing. Scout cannot leave this house alive. The wind rustled the pine branches outside Rob's house, masking the faint crunch of footsteps approaching from the rear. Inside, Jenna stood frozen by the study window, her gun drawn and heart pounding against her ribs. She didn't know what triggered the feeling, but she'd learned long ago not to ignore it. Scout was growling now, low and steady. His body pointed toward the back of the house like a compass locked on danger. She moved swiftly, switching off the desk lamp and slipping to the wall beside the hallway. Shadows stretched across the floor. Scout stood guard by the door, his breathing controlled, ears sharp. In his years on the force, he had chased down armed suspects, found missing children, sniffed out explosives. But this was different. This wasn't just an intruder. This was the man who killed his partner. And Scout remembered. Mercer eased the back door open with practiced precision, the safety on his pistol already off. He moved through the kitchen silently, stepping around the chairs with the caution of someone who'd done this before. His eyes adjusted to the darkness just enough to make out the hallway. Jenna was somewhere close, he could feel it. But he wasn't hunting her. Not yet. The dog came first. Jenna spotted the shadow just as it crossed the threshold. She didn't speak, didn't yell. Instead, she gave Scout a subtle nod, and the dog launched forward like a bullet. Mercer reacted too late. The impact knocked the gun from his hand as Scout slammed into his chest, snarling, teeth bared. The two crashed into the wall, picture frames falling to the ground. Jenna emerged from the darkness, aiming her weapon. "Don't move!" she shouted. Mercer struggled, trying to reach for the knife strapped to his ankle, but Scout bit down on his forearm, forcing him to scream in pain. Blood soaked the sleeve of his jacket. Jenna kicked the knife away and placed her boot on his chest. "It's over, Mercer," she said, voice shaking but firm. "You killed a good man, And this dog never forgot your face. For a long moment, Mercer just lay there, defeated, staring into Scout's eyes. Those same eyes that had recognized him the day of the funeral. Outside, police cruisers pulled into the driveway, with lights flashing but sirens silent. Delgado jumped out of the lead car, weapon drawn, and burst through the front door. What he saw was unforgettable. Mercer pinned to the floor, Scout standing guard, and Jenna, shaken but steady, holding justice in her hands. But as Mercer was cuffed and dragged outside, he muttered one last thing under his breath. "You think this ends with me?" The interrogation room was dimly lit, the air inside thick with the stale scent of sweat and cold coffee. Lieutenant Dean Mercer sat cuffed to the metal table, his left arm bandaged, his right hand twitching slightly. Across from him, Chief Delgado leaned in, his voice low and controlled. "Who else is involved, Mercer?" he asked. "We know you didn't do this alone." Mercer smirked, blood still crusted near the edge of his lip. "You wouldn't believe me even if I told you," he muttered. "But go ahead. Check every desk in this building. Half the men you trust have something to hide." Delgado didn't flinch. He had suspected this ran deeper, but hearing it confirmed felt like a punch to the chest. Jenna watched through the two-way mirror, arms crossed, her eyes fixed on Mercer like she was studying a predator behind glass. Meanwhile, Scout rested in the K-9 unit's break room, his breathing slow but alert. He had been checked by the department vet. No serious injuries, just scratches and exhaustion. But there was something in his stare that hadn't faded. He wasn't relaxed. He wasn't done. Jenna stepped in and knelt beside him. "You saved my life," she whispered, rubbing behind his ears. "And Rob's. You finished what he started." Back in the evidence room, a second flash drive was discovered, this time buried beneath a false panel inside Rob's cruiser. It had surveillance footage, documents, even a list of officers' names. Some were already under investigation for corruption. Others had spotless records. Among them was a high-ranking federal liaison, someone who'd once tried to shut down Rob's investigation. Delgado's hands trembled as he held the drive. "This isn't just local," he said. "This is federal." Mercer's words echoed in Jenna's mind. "You think this ends with me?" No, it was bigger. Rob had uncovered a network, a pipeline of dirty cops, payoffs, and confidential leaks. Mercer was the trigger man, yes, but someone else had loaded the gun. And the more Jenna thought about it, the more she realized they were still out there, watching, waiting, possibly inside the very walls of the precinct. As night fell over the town, Jenna sat outside the station on the cold concrete steps, Scout lying beside her. The stars above offered little comfort. Justice had been served, but only partially. She glanced down at Scout, who stared off into the distance, eyes sharp. "It's not over, is it?" she said quietly. Scout didn't move. He didn't need to, because he knew what was coming next. The early morning fog settled low across the town like a blanket of silence, cloaking the streets in gray. Jenna hadn't slept. Her mind kept circling back to the list of names found on Rob's hidden drive. Some of them were familiar. Some were close, too close, and one name stood out above the rest. A federal agent assigned to oversee interagency operations during Rob's last investigation. Agent Curtis Monroe. Chief Delgado had already reached out to Internal Affairs and Federal Oversight, but something was wrong. Calls weren't being returned. Emails went unanswered. It was as if Monroe had disappeared overnight. Jenna knew what that meant. He was either on the run or getting ready to bury what Rob had started for good. She loaded her weapon, clipped her badge to her belt, and whistled for Scout. He came without hesitation, eyes alert, body ready. The final trail had begun. Following a hunch from Rob's notes, Jenna and Scout drove out to an abandoned farmhouse just outside the county line. It had once been used for K-9 training over a decade ago, now long forgotten, except for one small detail. Rob had visited it twice in his final week, and no one ever asked why. As she pulled up the long dirt driveway, Scout began to growl again. The same low warning she had learned to trust with her life. Inside the house, Dust and rot clung to the walls, but fresh footprints littered the floor. Someone had been there recently. Scout moved first, sniffing along the doorway into what used to be a training bay. That's when Jenna heard it. A faint click, like a phone being hung up. She raised her gun. "Come out," she called, her voice firm. "You're not going to make it out of here." From the shadows, Agent Monroe stepped forward, hands slightly raised but no fear in his eyes. "I figured you'd come," he said calmly. "You're smarter than the rest." Jenna kept her weapon steady. "You killed Rob," she said. "You used Mercer, but this all started with you." Monroe smiled almost sadly. "Rob was too idealistic. He didn't understand the game. I tried to warn him, keep it quiet, but he kept pushing. And when he involved the dog, well, that complicated everything." Scout let out a snarl, inching forward, hackles raised. Monroe glanced at him, almost amused. "He was loyal to the end," he said. "Too bad loyalty doesn't stop bullets." Jenna's finger tensed on the trigger, every nerve in her body on edge. The air between them crackled with the weight of everything lost, and everything that could still be taken. The air inside the farmhouse was so still it felt like time had stopped. Jenna's arms remained locked, her gun pointed directly at Agent Curtis Monroe, who stood with his hands just high enough to appear harmless, but not high enough to stop her from pulling the trigger. Scout stood between them, his body tense, eyes locked onto the man who had orchestrated the death of his partner. "You don't want to do this," Monroe said quietly. "There's more at stake than you know." Jenna narrowed her eyes. "Rob knew enough to die for it, and you made sure of that." Monroe took a slow step forward, and Scout instantly lunged forward a few inches, barking once. Sharp, loud, final. Monroe froze, startled. His calm facade cracked. "You think killing me will end this?" he hissed. "This goes higher than you, higher than Rob. You're just cleaning up scraps." "I'm not here to clean up," Jenna replied. "I'm here to finish what he started." She could feel her hands sweating, but her grip didn't falter. And Scout didn't blink. His eyes never left Monroe. Jenna noticed something change in the agent's stance. A twitch in his right shoulder. She saw it a second before he moved. Monroe reached for something beneath his coat. It all happened fast. A flash of metal, Monroe's concealed weapon. Jenna shouted, "Scout!" And before her voice even echoed off the walls, the dog had already launched. Scout slammed into Monroe's chest, throwing him off balance and sending the pistol flying across the floor. They crashed hard into a pile of broken crates. Monroe struggled, but Scout had him pinned, teeth bared, the growl in his throat vibrating through the room like thunder. Jenna raced forward and kicked the weapon away, then pressed her knee into Monroe's back as she snapped the cuffs over his wrists. His face was twisted in fury, but he no longer resisted. "It's over," she said, her voice breathless. "You lost." Monroe let out a hollow laugh. "Maybe, but this doesn't stop with me." Jenna looked at him, calm and certain. "No, it doesn't. But now we know where to start." 2 days later, Rob Maddox was honored posthumously at the state capitol. His name added to the fallen officer's memorial. Scout sat at attention beside the podium, wearing Rob's badge clipped to his harness. When Jenna stepped up to speak, her voice cracked only once. Rob believed in truth. He believed that loyalty wasn't just a word, it was action. And Scout proved that. He never gave up. He remembered what mattered. And because of him, justice came home. As the crowd stood in applause, Scout looked toward the sky, just as a breeze swept across the memorial grounds. And for a moment, it felt like Rob was there, watching. Peace. Finally. If this story touched your heart, leave a like to honor Rob's memory and Scout's unwavering loyalty. And if you believe in truth, justice, and the kind of stories that truly move us, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell so you won't miss the next powerful stories of courage, sacrifice, and the unbreakable bond between humans and animals. Your support means everything.